I have lost them, all three. They look at me like strangers.
The teacup shattered against the nursery wall before the new governess even finished her curtsy. "Out," said the smallest boy, not shouting, just flat and certain, the way a judge delivers a sentence. Miss Prudence Kettering had lasted 4 minutes. The Duke of Marrowfield's triplets had broken her predecessor's spectacles, hidden the one before that in the coal cellar for 6 hours, and reduced a third to tears before she'd even reached the staircase. 12 nannies, 12 failures, 12 carriages rattling away from Thornhaven Hall in defeat. And through it all, the 3 boys had not spoken a single word since their mother's funeral 8 months before. Below stairs, in the servants' hall, the butler poured brandy for a duke who looked like a man drowning on dry land. "They will not speak to me either, Barnaby," said the duke, his voice low, raw. "My own sons look at me like a stranger." Then, across the county, in a rain-soaked coaching inn, a waitress named Hetty Fairweather was scrubbing tankards and losing her position for talking back to a drunken lord who'd grabbed her wrist. She had no notion that by week's end, she would be standing in the doorway of Thornhaven's nursery, 3 identical pairs of eyes fixed on her with open suspicion, and that what happened in that room would undo everything the great house believed about grief, about silence, and about who truly belonged in a duke's family. Because Hetty Fairweather was about to do what no nanny, no governess, and no physician in London had managed. She was about to make them speak. But first, she would have to survive the boys who had already broken 12 others before her. If you're watching this, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from today. Hit that like button if you love a slow burn Duke romance, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Rain hammered the windows of the speckled hair in the night Hetty Fairweather lost her position for the 2nd time in a year. "You struck a peer of the realm," the innkeeper hissed, wringing his apron like a man wringing a chicken's neck. "Lord Pemberton could have you thrown in jail for less." "He put his hand where it didn't belong," Hetty said, chin lifted, though her hands trembled as she untied her apron. "I'd do it again." She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing. Not when her father's cough had taken him 3 winters past. Not when her mother had followed a year after, leaving Hetty with 2 younger brothers, an empty larder, and a spine that had hardened into something unbreakable. By morning she was walking the muddy road toward Thornhaven village with a bundle of belongings and no notion of where she would sleep that night. It was old Mrs. Winlock, the baker's widow, who stopped her cart and offered a ride, and it was Mrs. Winlock who mentioned, almost carelessly, that the great house up on the hill was hiring again. "Thornhaven Hall," the widow said, snapping the reins. "Though I'd not wish that post on my worst enemy. The Duke's boys have chased off every governess in 3 counties. Poor lambs haven't spoken since their mother passed. Folks say the house itself has gone quiet as a tomb." Hetty said nothing, but something in her chest tightened at the words "haven't spoken." She knew silence. She had lived inside it for 2 years after her mother died, had watched her youngest brother stop eating properly, had learned that grief did not always announce itself with weeping. The gates of Thornhaven Hall rose out of the mist like something from a dream she hadn't asked for, wrought iron twisted into ivy and stags, and beyond them a drive lined with ancient oaks leading toward a house so vast it seemed to swallow the gray morning light. Hetty had scrubbed floors and carried trays in fine houses before, but nothing like this. Windows taller than doorways. Chimneys enough for a small village. A fountain, silent and dry, its stone nymph staring blankly at nothing. She was shown to the servants' entrance by a maid who would not meet her eyes, and left to wait in a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old wood until a tall, silver-haired man appeared, his face carved into lines of long-suffering patience. "You're here about the nursery position," he said. It was not a question. "I am, sir. I am Barnaby, the house steward. I must warn you before you waste both our time. 12 women have attempted this post since Christmas. The last one departed with her spectacles broken and her nerves in shreds." He studied her with something between pity and curiosity. "You do not look like a governess." "I'm not one," Hetty said honestly. "I waited tables at the Speckled Hare until yesterday. I can read and write and figure sums, and I know how to hold my ground when someone wants me to break." Something flickered in Barnaby's expression, gone as quickly as it came. His Grace is not seeking accomplishments. He is seeking a miracle. Come. He led her through corridors hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past a drawing room where the fire burned low despite the chill, and up a staircase that seemed to climb forever. The house was beautiful and utterly lifeless, like a painting of a home rather than a home itself. They found the Duke of Marrowfield in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door, one hand braced against the frame as though the house might tilt beneath him if he let go. "Your Grace," Barnaby said, "a young woman for the nursery post." He turned, and Hetty found herself unprepared for him. She had expected an old, hard-faced aristocrat, the sort who barked orders and dismissed servants without a glance. Instead, she saw a man perhaps 30 years of age, his dark hair unkempt, his eyes rimmed with the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in months. Grief had carved itself into his face the way water carves stone, slow and permanent. "Your name," he said. "Hetty Fairweather, Your Grace. You are not a governess." "No, Your Grace. I served tables at an inn." She expected him to dismiss her on the spot. Instead, he crossed the room slowly, studying her the way a man studies a locked door he has given up hope of opening. Every governess who has come through that nursery door has tried kindness, bribery, discipline, prayer. My sons have broken all of them, literally in the case of Miss Kettering's spectacles. He exhaled, and for a moment the Duke looked less like a nobleman and more like a man drowning quietly in his own home. "They have not spoken one word since their mother died. Not to me, not to each other as far as anyone can tell. Physicians in London have examined them and found nothing wrong with their tongues or their minds. They simply will not speak." "How old are they, Your Grace?" 7. Triplets. Julian, Ambrose, and Thaddeus. Something softened fractionally in his voice at their names, the only warmth Hetty had heard from him yet. "I do not know what you imagine you can offer that a dozen trained women could not, Miss Fairweather. But I am out of options, and out of patience with London's finest failing me one after another. I don't imagine I know children better than trained governesses, Your Grace," Hetty said carefully. "But I know what it is to lose someone and have the whole world expect you to grieve quietly and properly, on a schedule that suits everyone but you." The Duke's eyes sharpened on her, something unreadable passing behind them. For a long moment he said nothing at all. "The position pays adequately," he said finally. "You will have a room near the nursery. Barnaby will show you the way. I ask only one thing of you, Miss Fairweather, and I ask it in earnest." His voice dropped, and beneath the ducal composure Hetty heard something closer to pleading. "Do not give up on them after a single bad afternoon, as the others did. Give them more than an hour before you decide they cannot be reached." "I don't give up easily, Your Grace," Hetty said. "It isn't in my nature." He nodded once, as though that settled something, and turned back to the window, dismissing her without another word. Barnaby led her up a second staircase, narrower than the first, toward a wing of the house that felt colder than the rest, as though grief itself had settled into the plasterwork. Outside a heavy oak door he paused. "A word of caution," he said quietly. "They are not cruel children, whatever their behavior suggests. They are frightened ones. Their mother, the Duchess, was the only person who understood them entirely. Since she passed, they trust no one, and they have found that silence is the one weapon no one can take from them." He hesitated, hand on the door. "Miss Kettering called them wicked. I would ask you not to make the same mistake." He pushed the door open. The nursery was large, sunlit despite the gray morning, with 3 small beds arranged in a row and toys scattered with the particular carelessness of children who had stopped caring whether anything mattered. 3 boys sat on the window seat, identical dark heads bent together, and when the door opened they turned as one, 6 eyes fixing on Hetty with a wariness far too old for 7-year-old faces. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Hetty remained in the doorway a moment, feeling the weight of their stares, remembering exactly what it had felt like to be small and furious and grieving and utterly certain that no grown person in the world understood a single thing about what had been taken from her. She did not smile falsely. She did not crouch down and coo the way the others likely had. Instead she walked to the empty 4th chair by the window, sat down without being invited, and said nothing at all, simply looked out at the gray gardens beside them, matching their silence with her own. The boy nearest her, the one Barnaby would later confirm was Thaddeus, watched her from the corner of his eye with open suspicion, waiting, she suspected, for her to break first, to fill the silence the way every adult before her had. Hetty Fairweather did not break it. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the glass, and somewhere below in his study, the Duke of Merrowfield stood watching the same gray sky, wondering, not for the first time, whether his sons would ever speak again, and whether he had just made a terrible mistake hiring a girl from a coaching inn to save what 12 trained governesses could not. The first week passed in near total silence, and Hetty came to understand that silence, in this house, was not empty at all. It had weight and shape and rules she had to learn the way one learns the customs of a foreign country. She arrived at the nursery each morning at 7, before the boys woke, and she never announced herself with cheerful greetings the way she suspected the others had. She simply opened the curtains, laid out their clothes, and waited. Julian was always the first to stir, watching her from beneath his blankets with narrowed eyes, as though testing whether she would vanish the moment he blinked. Ambrose rose last and slowest, dragging his feet through each morning like a boy wading through water. Thaddeus rarely slept at all, or so it seemed, for Hetty often found him already sitting at the window when she arrived, staring down at the gardens where, Barnaby later told her, the Duchess had once kept a rose bed she tended herself. She learned their habits without asking a single question aloud, because questions, she quickly discovered, only made them retreat further behind their silence like snails pulling into shells. Instead she watched. Julian arranged his toy soldiers in the same formation every day, a battle line that never changed, as though rearranging them differently might undo some fragile order he needed to preserve. Ambrose drew pictures constantly, charcoal smudged across his fingers, sketches of a woman with a kind face that he tore apart the moment anyone looked too closely. Thaddeus spoke to no one, not even his brothers, and yet Hetty noticed he was always the one who moved first when something needed doing, as though he had appointed himself protector of the other 2 and had no patience left over for words. By the 3rd day, the housekeeper, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Pruitt, cornered Hetty in the servants' passage with her arms folded and suspicion written plainly across her face. "You've lasted longer than the last 3 combined," she said, not quite as a compliment. "Though I'll wager you'll crack same as the rest. That nursery's cursed, if you ask me. Nothing good's come out of that room since the Duchess passed." "I don't believe in curses, Mrs. Pruitt," Hetty said. Only in children who've been hurt worse than anyone's bothered to notice. Mrs. Pruitt's expression flickered, something almost like respect passing over her weathered face before she turned briskly away, muttering about supper preparations. But from that day forward she left an extra biscuit on Hetty's tray each morning without comment, and Hetty understood it for the small truce it was. The gardens became her greatest ally. On the fourth afternoon, when the rain finally broke and pale sunlight spilled across the lawns, Hetty did not ask the boys whether they wished to go outside. She simply opened the nursery door, walked down the stairs, and out into the gardens, trusting that curiosity would do what instruction could not. It took nearly 10 minutes, but eventually 3 small shadows appeared in the doorway behind her, cautious, then crept closer until they stood at the edge of the overgrown rose bed their mother had once tended, now tangled with weeds and neglect. Hetty knelt without a word and began pulling weeds from around the roots of a struggling rosebush. She did not look up to see whether they watched her. She simply worked, humming faintly under her breath, the same tune her own mother used to hum while mending clothes by candlelight. After a long while, she heard the soft scrape of small hands in the dirt beside her. It was Thaddeus who knelt first, tearing weeds away with unexpected ferocity, and within minutes his brothers had joined him, 3 sets of small hands working the earth in a silence that felt, for the first time since Hetty had arrived, less like a wall and more like a shared breath. The Duke observed this from his study window without their knowledge, and Barnaby later confessed to Hetty that his Grace had stood there for the better part of an hour, unmoving, watching his sons touch soil their mother had once loved, something in his posture loosening for the first time in months. Not every day brought such quiet triumphs. On the 6th day, disaster struck when Ambrose, frustrated by a drawing that refused to match the image in his mind, hurled his charcoal across the room and overturned a small table, sending a jar of water crashing to the floor. Julian flinched violently at the noise and pressed himself into the corner, hands over his ears, while Thaddeus moved instinctively to shield his brothers. His young face contorted with a fury that had nowhere to go because he would not give it voice. Hetty did not scold. She did not rush to comfort either, sensing that either response would only confirm to the boys that their pain was something to be managed rather than witnessed. Instead, she knelt on the wet floor beside the shattered jar and began gathering the broken pieces slowly, deliberately, as though this were the most natural task in the world. After a long moment, Ambrose crept forward and, without meeting her eyes, began helping her collect the shards. His small shoulders shaking with silent tears he refused to let fall properly. Hetty said nothing about the crying. She simply worked alongside him until the floor was clean, and when it was done, she placed a fresh sheet of paper and a new stick of charcoal in front of him without comment, an offering rather than an instruction. That evening, exhausted in a way she had rarely felt even after the longest shifts at the Speckled Hare, Hetty was summoned to the Duke's study. She expected reproach for the broken jar, perhaps even dismissal, and steeled herself accordingly as she climbed the stairs. Instead, she found the Duke seated rather than standing, a rare departure from his usual restless posture at the window, a single lamp burning low on his desk. He gestured for her to sit, an informality that startled her nearly as much as his next words. "Barnaby tells me you spent an hour in the garden with them yesterday," he said, "and that Thaddeus knelt in the dirt without being asked twice." "He did, Your Grace. My wife loved that garden more than any room in this house." His voice carried none of the ducal distance she had heard on her first day. It had worn thin, revealing something raw beneath. "I have not been able to look at it properly since she died. I ordered the gardeners to leave it untouched, though I could not have told you why, except that clearing it away felt like erasing her a second time." Hetty considered her words carefully before speaking. Perhaps it wasn't meant to stay untouched forever, Your Grace. Perhaps it was only meant to wait until someone was ready to tend it again. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes that Hetty could not quite name, and for the first time since her arrival at Thornhaven Hall, she saw not a grieving nobleman locked behind ducal formality, but simply a man, worn thin by loss, uncertain whether he was failing his own children beyond repair. "They have not spoken a single word to me in 8 months," he said quietly. "Not my name, not a complaint, not even a cry when they're hurt. I have begun to fear I no longer know how to be their father at all." "They haven't forgotten how to speak, Your Grace," Hetty said gently. "I don't believe that's what's happened. I think they've simply decided that speaking means the grief becomes real, and as long as they stay silent, some part of them can still pretend she might come back." The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Hetty feared she had overstepped badly, spoken with far more familiarity than her position allowed. But instead of anger, something like gratitude crossed his features, brief and unguarded, gone before he could stop it. "No one has said that to me before," he said. "Not the physicians, not the clergy, not a single governess in 8 months." He rose then, moving to the window as was his habit, staring out at the darkened gardens below. "Continue as you have been, Miss Fairweather. Whatever it is you are doing, it is more than any of them managed." Hetty left the study that night with her heart unsettled in a way she could not quite explain, carrying with her the image of a grieving father staring down at a garden he could not bring himself to enter, and 3 small boys who had chosen silence as their only remaining shield against a world that had taken their mother without warning or mercy. She did not yet know that the true test of her resolve was still ahead of her, waiting in the shadows of a house that held far more sorrow than anyone at Thornhaven Hall had told her. 2 weeks into her post, Hetty began to notice something the others, in their brief and frantic tenures, had likely never lived long enough to see. The boys did not simply refuse to speak. They watched everything, every gesture, every flicker of expression that crossed an adult's face, with the particular vigilance of children who had once witnessed something they could not undo and had decided the safest course was to trust nothing they were told afterward. It was Julian who gave her the first true clue, though he never meant to. Late one evening, when Hetty believed all 3 boys asleep, she found him standing at the nursery window in his nightclothes, staring down at the drive below where carriage wheels had once carried his mother away on the morning she died. Hetty did not speak or startle him. She simply came to stand beside him, close enough that he would know he was not alone, and together they watched the empty drive glisten under a thin veil of moonlight. After a long while, Julian reached out and gripped the hem of her sleeve, not tightly, but with the desperate carefulness of a boy who had learned that holding on to things too hard made them break. Hetty did not pull away. She let him hold on until his small hand finally loosened and he allowed himself to be led back to bed. And though he said nothing, she understood that something had shifted between them that night, some fragile thread of trust spun in silence and moonlight rather than words. The peace of those small victories was interrupted the following week by the arrival of a visitor whose carriage rattled up the drive with an air of unmistakable authority. Hetty watched from the nursery window as an elegant older woman descended, dressed in black silk despite the months since the Duchess's death, her posture rigid as a cathedral spire. Barnaby later informed her, with visible unease, that this was Lady Prescott, the late Duchess's own mother, and that her visits rarely brought comfort to anyone within Thornhaven's walls. Lady Prescott swept into the nursery without invitation that same afternoon, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of the room, the scattered toys, the charcoal-stained fingers of her grandsons, the presence of a young woman who was clearly not a proper governess by any measure she recognized. She did not address Hetty at first. choosing instead to kneel before her grandsons with a stiffness that suggested the gesture cost her some effort, murmuring soft endearments that none of the boys answered. "Still nothing," she said afterward, rising and turning her attention fully upon Hetty for the first time, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. "I am told you were hired from a public house." "I was employed at an inn, my lady," Hetty said evenly. "Before that." "And what qualifications does an innkeeper's girl possess that a dozen trained governesses lacked?" Lady Prescott's gaze swept over her with open disdain. "My daughter would be horrified to see her sons left in the care of a common serving girl, while the family name suffers further scandal with each passing week these children remain mute." Hetty held her ground, though something in her chest tightened at the casual cruelty of the words. "I couldn't say what qualifications your ladyship values most. I only know that in 2 weeks, Thaddeus has begun kneeling beside me in the garden without flinching, and Julian let me sit with him at the window last night without pulling away." "Small mercies," Lady Prescott said coldly, "will not restore this family's standing, nor will they undo whatever damage has already been done to 3 boys who ought by now to be readying for proper schooling among their peers." She turned toward the door, pausing only to add, almost as an afterthought, though Hetty suspected nothing this woman said was ever truly accidental, "I have already written to my son-in-law recommending they be sent to Brindlewood Academy before autumn. A house full of grief is no place to raise future gentlemen. Perhaps distance will accomplish what patience clearly has not." The words settled over Hetty like a stone dropped into still water, and she understood at once, watching the boys' faces during the exchange, that all 3 had heard every syllable, their small bodies gone rigid with a fear too large for their years. Thaddeus's hand found Ambrose's sleeve the moment Lady Prescott left the room, a wordless promise between brothers who had already lost one parent's presence and now faced losing each other's company as well. That night, Hetty sought out the Duke in his study, uncertain whether her position gave her any right to speak on such a matter, yet unable to remain silent while 3 children she had come to care for faced being scattered to a boarding school before the wounds of their grief had even begun to close. She found him standing over a letter bearing Lady Prescott's unmistakable seal, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Your mother-in-law believes Brindlewood Academy would serve them better than this house," Hetty said carefully, choosing not to soften the matter with pleasantries she did not feel. "She has believed a great many things these past 8 months," the Duke replied, his voice tight with something between exhaustion and old resentment. "That I have failed my sons. That their silence reflects poorly upon this family's reputation among the ton. That separating them from this house, and perhaps from each other's constant company, might shock them into speaking again." He set the letter down with more force than necessary. "She is not entirely without cause for her concerns, Miss Fairweather. I have watched 12 women fail before you. I cannot promise her or myself that you will not become the 13th. With respect, Your Grace, sending them away now would not shock them into speaking. It would confirm the very fear that's kept them silent this long." Hetty stepped closer, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath it. "They already believe that everyone they love eventually leaves them. Their mother did not choose to go, but in their minds, gone is gone regardless of the reason. If you send them from this house now, you will only be proving them right." The Duke turned to face her fully, and for a long moment neither spoke, the fire crackling low in the grate the only sound between them. Something passed across his face that Hetty could not name, grief and fear and something rawer still, the particular anguish of a man torn between the counsel of a woman who had known his wife longer than he had and the instincts of a father who suspected, perhaps for the first time, that his own instincts might be worth trusting. "I will not decide anything tonight," he said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier hardness. But I will not dismiss what you've said either, Miss Fairweather. You have spent more waking hours in that nursery these past 2 weeks than I managed in the 8 months prior, and I am not too proud to admit that troubles me more than Lady Prescott's letters ever could. Hetty left the study that night carrying a weight she had not anticipated when she first walked through Thornhaven's gates. The growing understanding that the boy's fate now rested not only upon her patience but upon a father's willingness to trust himself again, and a grandmother's determination to see them sent away before either of them found the courage to try. She did not yet know that within days, an incident far more frightening than any broken teacup or overturned table would force every person in that house to confront exactly how deep the triplets' silence truly ran, and how close they had all come to losing something far more precious than words. The incident came on a morning that had begun like any other, gray light filtering through the nursery curtains, the boys eating their porridge in their customary silence, while Hetty read quietly from a book of fables she had borrowed from the library below. It was Mrs. Pruitt who first noticed Ambrose missing from his chair, and by the time the alarm had spread through the household, the boy had been gone from the nursery for the better part of 20 minutes, long enough for genuine panic to take hold among the staff. Hetty's mind raced through every corner of the house she had come to know in her short weeks there, but it was instinct rather than reasoning that finally sent her running toward the gardens, toward the overgrown rose bed where the boys had first knelt beside her weeks before. She found him there, crouched at the edge of the ornamental pond that bordered the far side of the garden, staring down into the murky water with an expression that stopped her breath entirely. The pond had been drained for repairs the previous autumn and only partially refilled since, its edges slick with moss and its depth uncertain even to the gardeners who tended it. Ambrose stood at the very lip of the stone rim, one foot already testing the slippery edge, his charcoal-stained hands clutching a small wooden boat that Hetty recognized as one his mother had once given him, according to what Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned in passing weeks before. Ambrose. Hetty kept her voice low and even, forcing calm into it, though her heart hammered against her ribs. That water isn't safe. Come away from the edge, please. He did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on something in the water, and following his gaze, Hetty saw it, the small wooden boat's twin, already floating face down on the surface, clearly having slipped from his grasp moments before. It was, she understood suddenly, the last object he possessed that his mother had touched with her own hands, and he was prepared to climb into unstable water to retrieve it rather than lose it forever. She approached slowly, careful not to startle him toward the water rather than away from it, and knelt at the pond's edge herself, close enough to reach him but not so close as to crowd him into a panicked step backward. "I know that boat matters to you," she said softly, "but I promise you, I will get it out myself. You don't need to go in after it." For the first time since she had known him, Ambrose looked directly at her, his young face raw with a grief too enormous for his small frame to contain, and though he said nothing, his eyes carried a plea more articulate than any words could have managed. Hetty reached out slowly and closed her hand gently around his wrist, not gripping, simply anchoring him, and felt the tension in his small body waver between fighting and surrendering. It was in that fragile moment that the Duke arrived, having been alerted by a frantic footman, his boots skidding on the wet grass as he rounded the hedge and saw his son teetering at the water's edge. Hetty felt him freeze several paces behind her, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement or cry of alarm from him could send the boy stumbling backward into the pond rather than forward into safety. "Ambrose," the Duke said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a depth of anguish Hetty had never heard from him before, stripped entirely of ducal composure. "Please, come away from there." The boy's head turned slightly at his father's voice, the first time in 8 months Hetty had seen him acknowledge the Duke's presence with anything beyond blank avoidance, and in that fraction of a second, Hetty released his wrist and stepped into the shallow edge of the pond herself, her boots sinking into cold mud, and retrieved the small wooden boat from where it drifted. She pressed it gently into his hands the moment she straightened, and Ambrose clutched it to his chest as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had grown unbearably uncertain. The Duke crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides and gathered his son into his arms, lifting him away from the water's edge entirely, and for a long moment father and child remained locked together in an embrace that seemed to hold 8 months of unspoken grief within it. Ambrose did not speak, but he did not resist either, his small arms winding around his father's neck with a desperation that suggested some barrier between them had, for that brief instant, crumbled entirely. It was later that evening, once the boy had been changed into dry clothes and settled with his brothers, both of whom had clung to him with wordless relief upon his return, that Hetty finally allowed herself to sit down in the servants' hall and feel the full weight of what had nearly happened. Mrs. Pruitt brought her tea without being asked, setting it down with unusual gentleness. "You saved that boy's life today," the housekeeper said, settling into the chair opposite her. "Don't think the rest of us didn't notice. I nearly lost him," Hetty said quietly, staring into the steam rising from her cup. "If Mrs. Pruitt hadn't noticed him missing when she did, if I'd been even a few minutes slower reaching that garden." "But you weren't slower," Mrs. Pruitt said firmly. "You knew exactly where to look, when not a single one of those 12 governesses before you would have thought to search the gardens at all. That's not luck, girl. That's understanding those boys in a way no one else in this house has managed since their mother passed." Hetty said nothing to that, though the words settled somewhere deep and unfamiliar within her, a warmth she had not expected to feel in a house that had, until recently, seemed determined to remain cold and grieving forever. Later still, once the house had quieted and the boys slept soundly for the first time in what Barnaby claimed was weeks, Hetty was summoned once more to the Duke's study. She found him standing not at his usual place by the window but before the dying fire, his posture different somehow, less rigid, as though the day's events had cracked something open in him that could not easily be closed again. "I have spent 8 months believing myself entirely unequal to the task of raising 3 children through their grief," he said without preamble, his voice low and unsteady in a way she had never heard from him. "I told myself that hiring the finest governesses in London would somehow spare them from needing anything more from me directly. Today I very nearly lost my son because I had convinced myself that distance and delegation were kindnesses rather than the failures they truly were." "You reached him today, Your Grace," Hetty said gently. "He turned toward your voice before he turned toward mine. That matters more than you know." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the embers as though searching for something within them. "My wife used to say that Ambrose felt everything most deeply of the 3, that his silence would be hardest won and most fragile once broken. I did not understand what she meant until I watched him standing at that pond's edge today, willing to risk everything for the last piece of her he had left to hold. Then perhaps," Hetty said carefully, "the answer isn't governesses at all, Your Grace, trained or otherwise. Perhaps what they need most is simply more of you, not managed from a distance through hired hands, but present, the way you were today when his eyes found yours before mine." The Duke turned to face her fully then, something unguarded and searching in his expression that made Hetty's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "You speak to me with more honesty than any person in this household has dared in years, Miss Fairweather, servant or otherwise. I find I have come to rely upon it more than I perhaps ought to admit." Hetty held his gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, aware of something shifting quietly between them that neither position nor circumstance had prepared her to name, before dipping a careful curtsy and excusing herself from the room. She did not yet understand that the events of that frightening afternoon had set something irreversible into motion, not only within the fragile, healing hearts of 3 silent boys, but within the guarded heart of a grieving duke who had, for the first time in 8 months, allowed himself to lean upon someone else's strength rather than carrying the whole weight of his family's sorrow alone. Word of the incident at the pond traveled faster than Hetty could have anticipated, and within 3 days Lady Prescott's carriage once again rattled up the drive of Thornhaven Hall, this time accompanied by a second carriage bearing a physician Hetty did not recognize and a stern-faced solicitor whose presence alone seemed to drain the color from Barnaby's usually composed face. The household staff moved through the halls that morning with the particular hush that precedes a storm, and Hetty found herself summoned not to the nursery but to the drawing-room, where Lady Prescott sat enthroned upon the finest chair with the physician standing at attention beside her and the solicitor arranging papers upon a small writing table near the window. The Duke stood near the fireplace, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying a wariness Hetty had not seen in him since her earliest days at Thornhaven. "I am told," Lady Prescott began without preamble, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who believed herself entirely in the right, "that my grandson very nearly drowned in an ornamental pond while under the supervision of a girl with no formal training whatsoever in the care of children. I consider that sufficient grounds to question whether this household remains a fit environment for 3 boys already suffering such profound distress." "Ambrose did not drown, my lady," the Duke said, his voice tight. "He was retrieved safely, and by all accounts, the incident brought him closer to speaking than any moment in the past 8 months." "Closer to speaking is not speaking," Lady Prescott replied crisply. "I have consulted Dr. Halloran here, who specializes in disorders of the nervous constitution among children, and he agrees that the boys require structured medical attention that this house, however grand its gardens, cannot provide. I have also taken the liberty of consulting with our family solicitor regarding guardianship arrangements, given the clear pattern of neglect that has characterized their care since my daughter's passing." The word neglect landed in the room like a struck bell, and Hetty watched the Duke's hands curl into fists at his sides even as his expression remained carefully composed for the physician's benefit. She understood in that moment precisely what Lady Prescott intended, not merely to remove the boys to Brindlewood Academy as she had first threatened, but to challenge the Duke's very fitness as their guardian, using the pond incident as evidence to be wielded before whatever family council or court might ultimately decide such matters. "You cannot seriously propose removing 3 children from their father's care over an accident that occurred under vigilant supervision," Hetty said before she could stop herself, drawing every eye in the room toward her, including a warning glance from Barnaby stationed near the door. "And you are precisely the problem I intend to address first," Lady Prescott said, turning her full attention upon Hetty with the cold precision of a woman accustomed to dismantling obstacles efficiently. "A serving girl with no credentials, hired on impulse, permitted unsupervised access to 3 vulnerable children who nearly drowned under her watch. I have half a mind to have you dismissed this very afternoon and replaced with a properly certified nurse under Dr. Halloran's supervision." Dr. Halloran, a thin man with spectacles perched low upon his nose, cleared his throat and stepped forward with the air of someone accustomed to being the most authoritative voice in any room. "In cases of selective mutism following traumatic loss, structured medical intervention often proves more effective than well-meaning but untrained affection, Your Grace. I would recommend the boys be examined properly and potentially removed to a facility better equipped to address disorders of this nature." "They are not disordered," the Duke said, his voice rising for the first time Hetty had witnessed since her arrival, something fierce and protective breaking through his customary restraint. "They are grieving children who lost their mother without warning, and I will not have them treated as specimens for examination merely because their grief has proven inconvenient to manage." "Their grief," Lady Prescott said coldly, "has now nearly cost one of them his life. I loved my daughter, Your Grace, more than you can possibly comprehend, and I will not stand idle while her sons are endangered further by sentiment and a housemaid's instincts in place of proper medical care. The argument might have continued indefinitely had a small sound not interrupted it entirely. A sound so unexpected that every adult in the room fell instantly and completely silent. Standing in the doorway, having slipped away from the nursery unnoticed during the commotion, stood all three boys together, and it was Thaddeus, the eldest by mere minutes and the fiercest protector of his brothers, who had made the sound. It was not a word, not yet, but a raw, wordless cry of protest. The sound of a child who had finally found something worth breaking silence over, and it drew every eye in the room toward him as he crossed the floor and placed himself directly between his father and Dr. Halloran. His small chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. "No," Thaddeus said, and the single syllable, the first word spoken by any of the triplets in 8 long months, seemed to suck all the air from the room entirely. Lady Prescott's composure cracked visibly for the first time since her arrival, her hand rising to her chest as though the word had struck her physically, while the Duke sank to his knees before his son with an expression of such raw, disbelieving hope that Hetty felt her own eyes sting with unexpected tears. Dr. Halloran, to his credit, had the grace to fall silent and step backward, his professional detachment momentarily abandoned in the face of what he was witnessing. "Say it again," the Duke whispered, his hands hovering near his son's shoulders as though afraid that touching him might somehow undo the miracle unfolding before him. "Thaddeus, say it again, please." "No," Thaddeus repeated, his voice cracking with the effort of forming sounds his throat had refused to make for 8 months. Tears finally spilling down cheeks that had remained stubbornly dry through every crisis before this one. "You can't take us away. You can't take her away." He gestured with a trembling hand toward Hetty, standing frozen near the window. "She stays. We stay." Julian and Ambrose, seeing their brother's courage, crept forward as well, and though neither spoke, both moved to stand beside him, a silent triumvirate of resistance that no physician's diagnosis or grandmother's authority could easily dismiss. The Duke gathered all 3 boys into his arms without regard for his own composure, and for the first time since Hetty had arrived at Thornhaven Hall, she watched a father weep openly before his children, unashamed of grief that had finally found somewhere safe to break. Lady Prescott stood very still amid the scene, her expression a battlefield of emotions Hetty could not entirely name, grief and pride and something that might have been the first stirrings of shame at what her insistence had very nearly cost her grandsons. Dr. Halloran gathered his papers quietly and excused himself from the room without further comment, understanding perhaps better than anyone present that whatever science he had come prepared to offer had just been rendered entirely irrelevant by a single broken word. "Thaddeus?" Lady Prescott said finally, her voice unsteady in a manner Hetty had not thought her capable of. "You spoke." "I said no," Thaddeus repeated, turning to face his grandmother directly, his young face fierce despite the tears still tracking down his cheeks. "You want to take us away from here, away from Papa, away from Hetty. We don't want to go." The solicitor, sensing perhaps that his services were no longer required for the afternoon's business, quietly gathered his papers as well and slipped from the room, leaving Lady Prescott standing alone amid the wreckage of her carefully constructed argument, confronted by the very evidence she had claimed to seek, proof that her grandsons could indeed be reached, only not through the methods she had insisted upon. "I only wanted what was best for them," Lady Prescott said, and for the first time since Hetty had met her, the older woman's voice carried something genuinely vulnerable beneath its customary ice. "I lost my daughter. I could not bear the thought of losing them as well, of watching them fade into silence forever while I stood by and did nothing." "They are not fading, my lady," Hetty said gently, understanding suddenly that Lady Prescott's fierce interference had never truly been cruelty, but fear wearing the mask of authority. the same fear that had driven every person in this house to desperate measures since the Duchess's death. They are healing. Slowly, and in their own time, but they are healing. Lady Prescott looked at her grandsons for a long moment, still gathered in their father's arms, and something in her rigid posture finally seemed to soften, the fight draining out of her all at once. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "I have been fighting the wrong battle all along." She turned toward the Duke, her voice regaining some of its former composure, though its edges had been worn smooth by what she had just witnessed. "I will withdraw my petition regarding guardianship. But I will be watching closely, Your Grace, to ensure my grandsons continue on this path, whatever form their continued care may take." She left the room without further ceremony, her carriage rattling back down the drive within the hour, and though the danger of separation had passed for now, Hetty understood, watching the Duke's eyes meet her own over the heads of his sons, that something far more significant had shifted within Thornhaven Hall that afternoon than the mere threat of an unwelcome visitor, something neither of them yet had words enough to name. The weeks that followed Thaddeus's first word unfolded like spring arriving after a winter that had lasted far too long. It did not happen all at once. Ambrose found his voice 3 days later, over a drawing he had finally allowed someone else to see, murmuring the word "Mama" as he pointed to the woman's face in his sketch. Julian took nearly a fortnight longer, his voice returning first in whispers at the window where he and Hetty had stood together that first quiet night, before growing steadily into something closer to a boy's ordinary chatter. Thornhaven Hall itself seemed to wake alongside them. Windows that had remained shuttered through months of mourning were thrown open to let in the early summer air. The dry fountain in the front drive was repaired and set flowing again, its stone nymph no longer staring blankly at nothing but catching sunlight in scattered droplets each afternoon. Even the servants moved through the corridors differently, their footsteps lighter, their voices no longer hushed out of habit. Hetty found her days transformed as well. Where once she had spent long hours in careful, watchful silence, she now spent them answering an endless stream of questions from 3 boys who seemed determined to make up for 8 months of quiet all at once. Julian wanted to know everything about the speckled hair inn, about the travelers who passed through it and the stories they carried. Ambrose asked, with disarming directness, whether she had loved her own mother as much as they had loved theirs, a question that caught Hetty off guard the first time he posed it, though she answered it honestly all the same. Thaddeus, ever the protector, asked more practical questions, whether she intended to stay, whether anyone could make her leave, whether Lady Prescott might return with fresh objections now that the danger seemed to have passed. It was this last question that lingered with Hetty longest, because she did not entirely know the answer herself. Her position in the household had shifted in ways neither she nor the Duke had fully acknowledged aloud. She was no longer merely a hired hand brought in out of desperation. She had become, in the eyes of 3 young boys, something closer to family, and in the eyes of their father, something Hetty was only beginning to allow herself to name. The garden became the setting for what followed, as it so often had throughout that transformative spring. On a warm afternoon in early June, with the rose bed finally restored to something resembling its former glory under the joint efforts of the boys and the gardening staff, the Duke found Hetty alone among the blooms while his sons chased one another across the lawn with a freedom that would have seemed impossible mere months before. He did not speak at first, simply stood beside her, watching his children run and shout and laugh in a manner that still, even now, brought unexpected tears to his eyes when he least expected them. Hetty said nothing either, content in the particular companionship they had built together over months of shared worry and shared triumph, a companionship that required no filling of silence, only the comfort of standing side by side. "I have been trying to find the right words for weeks," the Duke said finally, his voice quieter than she was accustomed to hearing from him, stripped of the formality that had once separated them so completely. Every time I believe I have found them, they seem inadequate to what I actually wish to say. You've never needed elaborate words with me, Your Grace, Hetty said, watching Thaddeus scoop up a fallen rose petal and present it with great ceremony to his laughing brothers. Plain ones have always served us well enough. Very well then, plain words. He turned to face her fully, and Hetty saw in his expression none of the exhausted grief that had marked their first meeting in his study, only something steadier, something that had been quietly building through every shared crisis and quiet victory of the past months. You arrived at this house with nothing but the clothes on your back and a stubbornness 12 trained governesses could not match. You gave my sons back their voices when every physician and expert I consulted had failed entirely. And somewhere in the midst of all that, without my quite noticing how it happened, you gave me back something I had believed lost as well. And what was that, Your Grace? Hetty asked, though something in her chest already anticipated his answer. Hope, he said simply, that this house could be a home again, that my sons could laugh without guilt, and that I might learn to do the same. He paused, and for the first time since she had known him, Hetty saw genuine uncertainty cross his features, a duke unaccustomed to seeking anything he was not entitled to by birth or rank. I am aware of the distance our positions place between us, Miss Fairweather, and I would not ask you to disregard it lightly. But I find I can no longer pretend that what I feel for you is merely gratitude for services rendered. Before Hetty could answer, a small, urgent voice interrupted them both. Ambrose had abandoned his brother's game and now stood a short distance away, his expression uncharacteristically solemn for a boy who had spent the past weeks rediscovering laughter with the enthusiasm of someone determined never to lose it again. Are you asking her to stay forever, Papa? He asked, with the particular bluntness only a child could manage. Because Thaddeus says if you don't ask her properly, he's going to ask her himself, and he says he'll do it better than you would. A startled laugh escaped the Duke, genuine and unguarded, and Hetty found herself laughing as well, the tension of the moment dissolving into something warmer and far less formal than either of them had intended. Julian and Thaddeus abandoned all pretense of continuing their game and came running to join their brother, the three of them arranging themselves in a small, expectant row before their father, waiting with open curiosity for whatever came next. Thaddeus, the Duke said, feigning great seriousness despite the smile he could not entirely suppress. Am I truly in danger of being outdone by my own 7-year-old son in matters of courtship? You're taking too long, Thaddeus said with the same fierce directness that had once broken 8 months of silence in a single word. She stayed when grandmother wanted to send us away. She stayed when Ambrose nearly fell in the pond. She's not going to leave just because you're too slow to ask her properly. Hetty pressed a hand to her mouth to hide her laughter, though her eyes had gone bright with unexpected tears, and the Duke, apparently deciding his son's counsel could not be reasonably ignored, turned back to her with renewed resolve. Then I shall attempt to be neither too slow nor too formal, he said, taking her hand in his own, heedless now of who might observe them from the house's many windows. Hetty Fairweather, will you stay at Thornhaven Hall, not as their nursemaid, nor merely as my household's most stubborn employee, but as my wife, and as a mother to 3 boys who have already decided the matter entirely without my input? Hetty looked down at the 3 small, eager faces watching her with such open hope, and then back at the man beside her, whose grief had once seemed as permanent as the stone walls of his ancestral home, now standing before her transformed by months of shared struggle into someone who had finally remembered how to hope again. I will, she said, and the words had scarcely left her lips before all 3 boys erupted into cheers loud enough to send the birds scattering from the surrounding hedges, their laughter ringing across gardens that had once known only silence and sorrow. The wedding took place that autumn in the newly restored gardens. Beneath an arbor woven through with roses the boys themselves had helped cultivate back to life. Lady Prescott attended. Her earlier fierceness softened into something resembling pride as she watched her grandsons stand as attendants beside their father. No longer silent, no longer afraid, chattering happily with the guests who had gathered to witness a transformation few in the county had believed possible. Mrs. Pruitt wept openly throughout the ceremony, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had known from Hetty's very first day that the girl possessed something the trained governesses had lacked entirely. Barnaby, ever composed, allowed himself only the faintest smile, though those who knew him best recognized it as the closest thing to open joy the steady old butler ever permitted himself in public. Thornhaven Hall, once a house defined by its silence, became instead a home filled with the ordinary, precious noise of children's laughter, of a father's steady presence no longer buried beneath grief, and of a woman who had walked through its gates with nothing but resolve and had found, in 3 frightened boys and their grieving father, a family entirely her own. Years later, when travelers passed through the county and heard whispers of the waitress who had succeeded where a dozen trained governesses had failed, they often asked what particular secret she had possessed that the others lacked. Those who knew the family best offered the same simple answer every time. She had not tried to fix their silence. She had simply waited beside it, patient and unafraid, until 3 boys finally trusted the world enough to speak again. What do you think finally gave Thaddeus the courage to speak first? The fear of losing Hetty, or the fear of losing his father's fight to keep them together? Would you have made the same choice Hetty did, staying in a house that had already broken 12 others before her? And what do you imagine life at Thornhaven Hall looked like for those 3 boys years later, all grown, but never forgetting the woman who taught them that silence was never the only way to survive their grief? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Share your thoughts on how this story made you feel, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical romance dramas. I'll be reading and replying to as many of your comments as I can.